All right, hello everyone. Can you hear us? Awesome. Cool. All right. Hey, welcome everyone in the room and online. It's interesting to see how the ratio between physical and online is changing slowly but surely, and they're sort of craving to be back on campus and look each other into the eyes. But we welcome, of course, everyone who joins us wherever you are right now. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce Alexandra. But before I do so, let me also introduce Adela and Janine on their very first day. I think last time we had a session, you both were waving, and you only had a square centimeter. Now you've got a square meter. So it's wonderful to have you both here. And as you all know, Adela and Janine are our new postdoctoral fellows and with us for the next 20 years of their lives. So we are delighted to have you here. But let's move to those who are with us for a while. So Alexandra has done her master's by research here. Of course, her PhD more recently. You've got another master's from Swinburne as well. And like so many here, has sort of a dual identity working in industry, or should I say in the non-profit sector, as well as on the academic side. And this is where QET continues, whether it's teaching or research, tries to get its inspiration where demand meets capability, where amazing research questions come from the outside and then in a rigorous way are digested, resolved, and then communicated back. Today, you'll share an existing paper, but a paper that's only step one of a larger research engagement, identified 14 or so patterns that you will cluster and consolidate. And I like the title, playing piggy bank in the middle. So no doubt we all will learn a lot, but I also hope that you walk away with some insights. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that warm welcome. Is this microphone working clearly? Can everybody online hear well? Can we see who's in the room? Thanks, Anissa. Okay, thank you. So is the volume okay for everybody? Could I have a nod or thumbs up, please? Perfect. Thanks, Marcia, much appreciated. So yes, my name's Alex Williamson. I'm part of the research team within the Centre for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Studies, but also within the Centre for Future Enterprise. And what I've chosen to do today is to talk about a paper that that was published in January of this year, and it came out of lockdown last year, I suppose is the best way to put it. So it was a Anissa, can I scroll through here? Sorry, just trying to sort the yeah, next slide. Can I? Okay, so yes, before we actually get into the body of the presentation, I would of course like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which some of us are meeting today, and acknowledge that everybody who is joining online will be on Indigenous lands also, and perhaps feel free to share where you're based in the chat forum. We like to pay respects to the elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits of the Turrbal and the Yugara as the First Nations owners of these lands, acknowledging, of course, that where we meet today has always been a place of teaching, research, and learning. And we equally acknowledge the important and ongoing role that Indigenous people play within the QUT community. So this paper, there's a lockdown paper from 2020. I wrote it with a collaborator and indeed friend, Dr. Diana Leet. Diana is a global authority in the philanthropy space. She bases herself somewhere between London, Edinburgh, and Paris. And like us in Australia, was in lockdown for a significant portion of last year. So we were doing Zoom drinks one night, as you do. And we decided we'd sort of play around with a paper. It ended up being submitted to the Australian Journal of Public Administration. It's a journal I've published in 3 times before this paper, and actually had a 4th paper accepted in that journal yesterday. So it's turning out to be a journal that I'm where my work is sort of accepted and recognised. And in a sense, I give credit to the journal because there are many public administration journals internationally that aren't particularly interested in philanthropy. They don't see it as being part of the public sector and the public domain. But however, this journal accepts short papers. So we thought, let's play around with the paper. Let's put together something that is not an empirical paper, but nevertheless not entirely conceptual either. We made it sort of quite a pragmatic one. We wanted it to function as a tool or a framework that people within the philanthropy sector could actually use, could adopt and say, okay, when we think about our organisation, how could we use this paper to accept us? And we gave it a bit of a fun title as well, because we wanted it to be kind of non-academic. We didn't want the title of the paper to, use theoretical terms or to be any way off-putting to readers. So that was the genesis of what we did. The motivations. We really wanted to try and extend the way that both academics and practitioners thought about what it is that philanthropic foundations actually do. So philanthropic foundations, I think the definition that we adopted in this particular paper was those that have in the primary business of distributing resources, almost always in the form of money through grants, rather than sort of providing services. But foundations are these odd creatures in a sense, because they are limited to employing, if you like, others to perform services for them. And the legal term foundation has no meaning in Australia. So there is no entity that is a foundation with a legal meaning to that. Most of them are established as charitable trusts, but not all. You can establish a company and call it a foundation. You can establish a benefit corp and call it a foundation. Some of them are associations. So there's an enormously wide range of underlying legal structures with the word foundation put on top of them. It's a bit like a surname, I think, is the best way to conceptualize it. It identifies, but it doesn't necessarily carry meaning. And so in the name of the most common legal structure for foundations in Australia, they're called ancillary funds. And that word ancillary simply means supporting. So these are organisations that can't effectively do stuff for themselves. They rely on others to do it for them. And thus the conceptualisation of them acting purely as a piggy bank. So foundations, what do? They undoubtedly make grants, they distribute funds, but they also mediate, they intercede, they intervene, they arrange, they broker, they buffer, and they filter. And all of these roles can be done in formal ways, but also in informal ways. And the range of these roles is often overlooked, particularly in the academic literature. And it creates sort of a potential for a certain amount of misunderstanding of these organisations and what it is indeed that they can and do contribute. So what we wanted to do in this paper was to really think about providing some quite nuanced descriptions of these multifaceted and multi-directional roles that foundations play. So instead of just here's the pot of money, it makes a grant. There's a beneficiary organisation, they do stuff with it. That's a very linear model, and we wanted to try and expand that and reconceptualize it. It's much more complex and subtle than this simple channel for money. We also wanted to think about the way, the how, if you like, that these exchanges of value between foundations and their stakeholders took place, with the idea, of course, of providing public benefit. These organisations are endorsed as charities. They must have a public benefit purpose. So what we try and do is to actually delineate these roles. We started out, to be honest, with 6. So when we were first scoped the paper, we went, okay, we can identify 6 roles. And we ended up with 14. So we more than doubled the number that we came up with as a consequence of trying to do this process of delineation, of saying, well, is that the same as this? Is this activity, this role that foundations play, does it fit within this other group, or do we need to create something new for it? So yes, we were aiming to develop a framework that foundation trustees and managers can use to actually monitor roles that they play in their own organisations. So the quote from Phillips there, that's Professor Susan Phillips at Carleton University in Ottawa. She talks about the public policy role of foundations and how that's increasing over time, as indeed the number of foundations and the wealth that they hold is increasing globally. Sometimes what they do can be quite quiet and hidden, particularly in private foundations, and those are typically those established by a family or an individual. They, in Australian context, they have lower public reporting requirements than public foundations. So even though the reporting to the regulator is the same, that doesn't necessarily get disclosed by the regulator. So there are some differences here between the groups of foundations, indeed, in the roles that they play. And foundations are quite sort of famous for having independence and autonomy. So there's a quote by Helmut Anheuer, who's another of the giants in the philanthropy world. And he says that, you know, they're not accountable to election cycles and they don't report to shareholders. So these organizations do have a kind of freedom, if you like, without necessarily obvious forms of accountability. And sometimes, you know, that means that a foundation can play a role as kind of an honest broker in relationships between donors and beneficiary organizations. It's because they're not seen to have a particular allegiance with either of those two groups. So we came up with 14 intermediary roles. When we first submitted the paper, we just left it as a list of 14. The reviewers did not like that. They wanted the roles clustered or grouped. They said that a list of 14 was too long. They're actually quite keen for us to try and cut the list of 14, but we refused to do that and got away with it. But we were strongly encouraged to put them into these groupings instead. So those are the ones we've got here. We've got the bringing parties together, and we had 5 particular roles that were within that. Capacity building, relationships, 4 roles. The idea of being a temporal bridge, 3 separate roles under that. And then the idea of being intermediaries at a sector or institutional level. Okay, so I just want to grab some notes here. So the first of these roles was acting as a filter. And for foundations, being a filter was most commonly sort of done between donors' interests and objectives and the things that they weren't interested in. So this was involved sort of providing guidelines and criteria for funding that allowed donors to specify and focus their giving on their own particular interests. And so their intermediary role of the actual foundation as an entity was about excluding, filtering, sorting, and sometimes ranking. The second role that we defined was acting as a privacy shield. So here the foundation could intermediate between known and unknown actors. And this was sometimes about protecting individual donors from unwanted direct approaches for funding. So allowing people who had wealth and were interested in distributing it or sharing it, but sort of screening them from the embarrassment or the difficulty of being directly approached and saying, well, you know, I know you want me to fund this thing. I'm not interested, go away. And it's interesting, my professional background included working at one of Australia's larger foundations. This was 15, 20 years ago now. And that was the Ian Potter Foundation. And it was quite famous within the foundation that Sir Ian established the foundation so that he wouldn't be approached in the club, you know, in the Gentleman's Club in Collins Street in Melbourne, so that he could, if somebody did come up to him and say, you know, I've got this project, this charity that I'm involved with, would you support it? And his reason, his, you know, written reason for establishing his foundation was that so he could tell them, go and talk to the people at the foundation. That's how I do my giving. So it was established very much as a way of creating an intermediary organization between himself and those who are seeking funding. But foundations can also here act to screen an individual or a donor's or founder's interests about what they choose to fund. And sometimes this is where the choice of what they want to fund is contentious. So for example, in US foundations, if the donor is interested in supporting something like abortion or assisted dying, then using the foundation to fund can actually act as a screen for their own personal interests here. Sometimes what people fund can be contrary to a publicly held position, such as a religious faith. And again, the foundation can sort of be the intermediary party here. Also politically contested agendas, such as those currently with us around climate change or immunization. And sometimes also privacy around something about a donor's individual or family life that they don't wish to share. So for example, an illness, a disability, or a health condition. So that's that privacy shield role. The third one here under this idea of bringing parties together was the idea of acting as a matchmaker. And so this is where there are seekers, if you like, or those who want to have something or they want to achieve something, to have something done. And then the providers, or those who have the skills to make something happen. And remember here that foundations can't undertake programs, deliver services themselves. They're reliant on others to do that for them. And so the providers can sometimes be people who have a skill, such as, I don't know, artists or researchers, for example, or those who are geographically placed to achieve something, such as somebody who is in a location that the foundation isn't in. So the matchmaking isn't just between organizations that are seeking grants. Sometimes the matchmaking can come out from the foundation where they need skills that they don't have. And then a final two roles under this first group of bringing parties together. The first one of these is acting as an aggregator. And this is where a foundation can bring groups of donors together. So this is quite common in what we call public foundations, or more specifically, public ancillary funds. And the idea here is that these foundations accept donations from a much larger group of people, aggregate those donations and bring them together to enable donors with common interests to achieve something much bigger as a collective than they might do as individuals. And the final role in this group is acting as a tax-deductible proxy. This is where sometimes donors want to support an organisation that doesn't have the necessary tax-deductible status for them to receive a deduction against their personal income tax for the amount that they've donated. And this is where foundations can, is that my echo or is that somebody else online? It's gone. Yeah, so this is where foundations can take advantage of the tax deductible status of a particular organisation and use that as a channel to distribute funds to a cause. The classical example here is where foundations cannot give to public schools, to public education, because public education is not charitable, it's part of government. And so there are a couple of foundations that have been specifically established by government to act in this role as an intermediary. So that's the first and the biggest group, bringing parties together. The second group is capacity development, relationship building. And here this is about a foundation acting as a negotiator or translator between different positions. And this is where foundations, I suppose, can speak different languages. So they work both with donors and with beneficiary groups. And sometimes those two parties are interested in the same things, but come to a discussion with very different conceptualizations and consequently different language. And because foundations deal sort of routinely with both groups, they can quite effectively work in the middle between the two of them. So they, I suppose, translate languages, if you like, or words within languages, but also cultures. So perhaps an example of this is where donors don't understand why an issue can't just be sorted. Like, if I give you money, can't you fix it? Whereas a grantee may be a much better place to understand the complexities of a particular issue. And then the second role within this capacity development group is foundations acting as a hybrid. And perhaps the best example of this is corporate foundations. And those are established generally by a for-profit organisation and either are initially or funded in an ongoing manner by them. And So corporate foundations are slightly hybrid entities in the sense that they exist for a public benefit purpose, but they are nevertheless funded by an organisation that sometimes has a particular utility or instrumental need for that hybrid intermediary organisation. And the foundation can act, I suppose, to enhance the corporate's legitimacy and reputation as well. Okay, and then the second two roles within this second group, a role as an agenda setter. And this is where foundations undertake what can sometimes be referred to as framing. So by the choice of organisations that they fund, they are able to set a policy frame around a particular issue and achieve a certain amount of interest in doing that. The cord's too short. Sorry, we're struggling with the length of the microphone cord here a little. And then the final role here is simply as a capacity builder. And that's talking about the difference between a foundation being able to support a particular charity or organisation, but then having done that, moves that organisation from a position of lack of agency to having a much greater ability to create change on a particular issue or indeed in a particular geographic location. I realise I'm going to ruin this now by moving back in. Okay, so the third group, this one only has 3 roles within it, and this is the group talking about temporal bridging. So the first of these roles is simply as a holding place. So this is often recognised in literature around entrepreneurship and philanthropy, where somebody who has a very large and sudden influx of wealth from the sale of a business can use a foundation as kind of a parking place for those funds in between the event, I think it's called, you know, of the sale of the business, and then the decision to distribute funds for public benefit to charities, but not wanting to necessarily have to do that with a tight time frame. This obviously often relates to tax and to taxation events around a sudden influx of wealth. But on a smaller scale, foundations can also be used to smooth the ability to support charities over multiple years. So where an individual, you know, has income in years 1, 3, and 5, but wants to distribute to charities right across, then a foundation can enable that kind of smoothing to take place. The second of these roles under temporal bridging is where foundations act as an intermediary between generations of a family. And in the literature...
That's right, I'm just going to put your monitor's laptop and dock there. We're going to use your dock because you've got one already.
Okay.
Oh, okay, it's pretty dicey.
I think somebody, Wendy, is that you?
So
thank you. Sorry, so yes. With the founders of foundations, this is one of the things they talk about most often, is that they want the foundation to act in a way that builds connections and engagement between, say, a grandparent and grandchildren, or parents and children. That the foundation can, I suppose, act as a focus that enables multiple generations to have an activity where they all have a voice and they collectively make decisions, and those decisions assumedly reflecting the family values. And the last one here, this idea of them being a wealth custodian as foundations as intermediaries between eras in society. And this one's often talked about when there are discussions or research around the way that philanthropic foundations have or raise questions of intergenerational equity. So what right one generation has to have extracted wealth, and then whether they have a commitment or an obligation to distribute those funds in the present time or whether they have a moral obligation to set some aside for future needs. Often comes up in research around questions of foundations that are what they call sunset foundations. So they're established with a deadline by which they must distribute their funds and close down. That can be a deadline in terms of an actual year, or it can be a deadline in terms of the death of the last generation of a particular family, for example. And then the final group of these intermediary roles is those where foundations work at an institutional or sector level. And here the two roles we identified were as a risk absorber and as a vector for ideas and norms. So the first one was an intermediary, obviously, between failure and success. And foundations, coming back to that idea of them not being as directly accountable, have the ability to fail with few, if any, consequences. And so where a foundation is an intermediary, they can say, well, yes, we'll fund this program. And to us, it's not really important whether it succeeds or fails. We may learn more from failure than we might do from success, if you like. And so particularly for governments, it's often valuable to have foundations funding a pilot program where an idea, a risky idea, can be tested. And if the program fails, then the foundation's in the middle acting as the buffer. And the last one as a vector for ideas and norms. And this is this idea of foundations as an intermediary between knowledges. And here knowledges refers to both the idea of research, academic knowledge, and local community lived experience knowledge, but also the knowledge between sort of what is accepted and known and what is unknown. Because of course, all foundation grants are made with a future in mind. You cannot make a grant to change the past. And so any grant made by a foundation is an expression of a desired future. And in that sense, they are acting as a vector between sort of what we know now and what we might know in the future. So in summary, those are the 14 intermediary roles that we talked about. I don't think that list is fixed. And that's part of my reason for wanting to present this paper today, because I think, firstly, this is not even a conceptual paper in some ways. It's, as I said, it was a lockdown one, and the focus of it was very much on providing a framework or a checklist for practice, for practitioners, for philanthropists. So there are questions around whether if we tried to test these 14 roles empirically, what we would end up with, whether some of them would be rejected, whether some of them would be amended, and whether we would need to add others indeed to that list. For me, I think I found that the idea of the temporal roles the most interesting, because I think temporality is something that we really don't engage with enough as researchers. We tend to either do longitudinal studies of the past, or we do point in time studies in the present, but we don't often think about the future and the relationship between the past to the future and the present to the future. So for me, I think that that particular group of those three roles around temporality were really quite fascinating ones. And in a sense, particularly well suited to philanthropy and this idea of resource transmission and wealth transmission across generations. But also because many foundations, you know, there's not an annual report to shareholders, there's not an election cycle. They can, if they so choose, fund projects for 10 years, for 20 years, for 50 years. They have the capacity to do that, but generally don't, to be honest. Most foundations kind of top out at about a 10-year mark. In terms of the identity of the foundation, founders tend to think to their grandchildren, but not beyond. So in a sense, there's a pragmatic funding for 10 years commitment. That seems to be the horizon of that. It's very difficult to go more than 10 years. And in terms of the lifetimes of foundations, it seems to be difficult for people to think beyond a third generation. But I do find this particular group of roles really interesting. And this in particular is something that I would like to expand into future research. So I think at the end of making this list, we came up against the question of, why do you actually need a foundation? Surely the donor can just give to the charity. You know, cut out the middleman altogether. Why do we need these foundations as these piggy banks in the middle? And I think what we came up with was that the idea that foundations are sort of redundant assumes that they are passive, and that they are, in fact, in the way that they play some or multiple of these intermediary roles, is actually quite a dynamic and interactive part of their work. And it, in fact, changes the relationship that might otherwise exist between a donor and a beneficiary. And again, examples of that are that smoothing over time idea, where a donor can make a much stronger commitment to an organization if they have something buffering their financial donations in the middle. So these roles, I think, are often seen as an add-on, where they are recognized at all, to the dollars, the flow of money through foundations. And yet I think it's an interesting reconceptualization of foundations, just to say, well, actually, these are all the things that they do. Money is one of them. But the other thing that we talked about was, if we are talking about foundations as being a piggy bank, playing a game of the child's game of piggy in the middle, and in that game, you know, the ball is thrown between two parties, and sometimes it goes to the person in the middle, and then the game changes. So we were thinking about, well, actually, what's the ball? If we're playing the game, what is the ball? What's being transferred between the actors in the exchange? And we came up there with a list of things that were transferred as a consequence of intermediary roles. And I think they group fairly nicely into the first three: the context, networks, and connections. A second group of ideas, skills, and expertise, perhaps intellectual property, and then beyond that to legitimacy, status, trust, and reputation. So that's something else I think that might be worth empirical exploration, is to actually find out what those exchanges constitute. So having published the paper in January of this year, I was then invited to write a blog post about it for Philanthropy Australia, and they are the national membership association for grant-making trusts and foundations. And so the blog post was titled, "What is it about foundations' role as piggy in the middle?" But when I received the invitation, I said, okay, I'll do it, sure. But my condition is that you subsequently invite two CEOs of foundations to respond to the paper and the blog post in the subsequent week. And two of them did that. One of them was the CEO of an organization, a community foundation called Give While You Live Foundation, that's based in Geelong in Victoria. And then the other one was the development person, I think, for the Rural Development Foundation. And I should just check that name. So yeah, they both took up the challenge and read the paper and responded to it. And their responses were both sort of classically, okay, it's a checklist, so I'm going to run through my foundation and talk about what it's doing, which in a sense was exactly what we wanted them to do. So that was the intent of the paper, and they applied it. Both of them, interestingly, didn't identify strongly with more than 4 or 5 of those roles. So that was a kind of tiny little real world test of the paper. And my best guess would have been that they would have identified with maybe more like 6 to 7, so about half of what we identified. Of that sort of not sample of 2, but they were somewhat below what I was expecting. And that in itself was interesting as well. So Benjamin, I think I really like her work. Lane Benjamin from the US, Susan Phillips, Canada. It's a great paper title, that one. And then Dale Thompson, and of course the paper itself that we did. So what I would really like from here is to get some thoughts about ways in which we could either extend this research or achievably and affordably test some of the conceptual assumptions that we've made. And I'd like to see this as, I suppose, as the first in a series of papers that explore, perhaps following my interest in those temporal roles for foundations, but I think there's a lot more we could do with it, and I would really value thoughts and suggestions. Thank you.
Exceptionally well done. Thank you so much for the well-structured presentation, well-articulated presentation, highly relevant presentation, and a presentation that connects to so many pieces of work here. I mean, looking at Irvin, who thinks about two-sided market models. Wasana will present very soon around boundary spanning and the whole idea of boundary spanning, and two-sided trust models came up in our trust work. So I think that there's tons of connections. The two things that are obvious, of course, sort of what's the quality of the model? Are these the 14 rows? How do you know? And the second one, as you highlighted, what are the affordances? Imagine it's true. What's the sort of academic and professional contribution? With this, I'd like to invite a bit of a conversation and discussion, especially with a view on, and this has been articulated in academia or semi-academia and industry. Where could we take it next? What will be like a complementary, feasible research question that builds on this? So I welcome any comments or questions from the physical or the virtual audience here. So Adela, because of this, so if you don't mind coming up. So Adela Wasana, I think Irvin as well.
Thank you. Thank you for a really great presentation. So I was wondering, out of curiosity, two CEOs of foundation, did they found themselves in the same 4 roles, or was it different, and which roles were there? Thank you.
Thanks. Yes. So no, they didn't identify the same 4 roles. There was overlap from memory, and I'd have to go back and read their responses, but from memory, they overlapped on 2 and then diverged from there. So the ones on which they overlapped were acting as an aggregator. That was really important to them, that they were able to bring multiple funders together. And this depended a little on their legal structure, but they could either bring in donations to their own foundation, or they could co-fund with other foundations. So that aggregating role functioned at those 2 different levels. And then the other one that they both identified was to see themselves as being in capacity building roles, so that one of them actually expressed it as sort of seeing an organization's future for it. And so they thought, well, if we fund something, then we can see perhaps more clearly than the beneficiary where they could get to as an organization. So I thought that one was really interesting too, because it took this capacity building idea, which I'd kind of bucketed in with, you know, those relationship development qualities, but they saw it as actually a temporal role and a visioning role, which was quite different. Sure.
Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. And I have a couple of things that I would like to clarify as higher level learnings that I could take away from this. So when we are working in research, there's lots of new concepts that we want to conceptualize, different types of artifacts or different types of practices. I'd like to understand a little bit more about the method that you had used to conceptualize this, and what lessons do you think you could share with us in terms of that process?
So this is where I relied quite heavily on my co-author. Diana has a wealth of both academic but also professional experience in the philanthropic sector. So she's written, you know, well over 10 books on philanthropy and philanthropic approaches, but she also has held some very significant and senior roles within philanthropic foundations. She was one of the trustees on the Diana Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. And I think that was a remarkable learning experience for her and all of her fellow trustees in terms of trying to interpret the wishes of, in that case, an entire nation of donors and reflect them through the eyes of what was wanted by family members and reflecting the identity of a particular individual. So as an exercise in philanthropy, it was a fascinating one. But I also drew somewhat on my own experience, my professional experience, because I worked in trusts and foundations for about 15 years before coming back to academia. So the short answer to the question is they came from our own professional experience in combination with what we had learned from pieces of academic research, not specifically on that topic, but around the philanthropic foundations as a whole. So Diana had also has written about sort of creative foundations, so those that have a focus on the generation of ideas and knowledge and capacity. So yeah, it was the process was one of discussion and iteration, because as I said, we started with a list of 6. And we sort of thought, oh, yeah, that's it. We've got 6, fantastic. And then started to try and define and delineate them and say, this one is different from this one because. And in the act of doing that, we ended up deciding that there were, in fact, more than twice the number that we started with.
How do you validate this? Or, I mean, you both have a lot of experience, but how do you convince the reader that this is close to?
Yeah, so I think, to be honest, we didn't see that as our responsibility in the paper. We wanted to set out a list and say that this is a checklist or a framework that you can use, and that at the outset, we couldn't think of any foundation that would identify with all 14 roles. And so I think what could come from an empirical test is the fact that some of them that we can imagine existing don't actually exist. So I think it would be fascinating to sort of go out there and test it and say, well, look, can you go through your checklist and say, do we play these roles? Have we ever played these roles? Might we ever play these roles? And get some significant numbers around that, and then start to say, well, you know, nobody actually talked about this one. Maybe this one's a figment of our imagination. So Wendy, do you want to turn your mic on and ask a question, or shall I just work from the chat?
I can certainly verbalise that question and make it more lively. So Alex, thank you for your presentation. My question is, I actually have been reviewing articles that are starting to quote your article, which is exciting given that it's pretty new. Would you recommend that others consider this type of typology or reflection paper on organisations in their own space? And how do you feel this is most useful to other academics in this space? I think it's one of those useful conceptual pieces that others, as you say, can build upon and grow. And I think that is a very good contribution.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, it's interesting to me that it's already being perhaps cited or in papers that are under review. I picked up the other day that there was a paper presented at the Academy of Management conference this year, which took on board this paper and indeed another one that I've recently published, and compared and contrasted the two. So that was a sort of moment. But the way in which that author had used the checklist was to say that it was a useful frame for them, I think is the best way of saying that. They said, okay, well, if these are the 14 roles, then they're not going to apply in every way to my lens on philanthropy, but by thinking about them all, it was a way of expanding the scope of what they had initially framed or conceptualized in their paper. So this particular paper was around strategic philanthropy, which is, you know, there are so many multiple definitions of this, but that was that idea, Wendy, of talking about sort of the founder or the donor setting a goal and thinking about philanthropy as a way of getting to that goal, rather than saying, identifying either an issue that they wanted to target, but they would be responsive to ways in which they might do that, or indeed defining a place that they wanted to support and considering what issues were relevant in that place. So this particular author was focused on this idea of strategic philanthropy and used the checklist as a way of saying, these are all the tools that a foundation might use to get from A to their defined goal of B. So that was quite interesting. In doing this paper, I think I was really quite reliant on Diana as a co-author, because I don't think I could firstly, I don't have the depth of practical experience in the field that she does, or indeed research experience. So I drew very much on that. But it was also the discussion between us that was so valuable in actually arriving at those 14 roles. And so I couldn't have written it without her. And I think it would be difficult to write something like this as a sole author.
Thank you. Yeah, so coincidentally, I did my PhD on intermediaries in business networks, and then in particular with e-commerce. So there may be some parallels across. But so what I found there is, like, if you take a typical retail value chain, so you see clear drivers in these traditional value chains while you have intermediaries, like it's economies of scale and assortment and so on. And you also see different types of intermediaries, like you have wholesalers and retailers, for example, in this supply chain. So I was wondering if those kind of ideas could kind of add a bit more to, and it may also help you say why certain intermediaries have certain roles. Like if you're that type of intermediary, you may more focus on these roles versus if you're, so I was thinking, yeah, thinking in terms of drivers and types may give you guidelines on which roles are suitable when. It was my second question comment is indeed, so what I see in my area is that intermediaries reinvent themselves. So intermediaries do now different things than they did 10 years ago because of drivers in their environments. So, for example, technology changes has made marketplaces possible. So you now see retailers and marketplaces competing where that traditionally was not the case. So that, like, and I think in the philanthropy sphere, you may see things like crowdsourcing. So there may be a theme about how technology is pushing changes in these intermediary roles. And my last comment about practicality. So you now present as a checklist, and I think you mainly talked about existing intermediaries. Yeah. You may also think, okay, if I want to set up a new foundation, can my model, or can some variation of this model, give these people some advice? Okay, if I want to set up a foundation in this space, then my checklist can help me to better conceptualize what kind of foundation I want to be. So yeah, I would just, yeah, 3 things to.
Thank you. Yeah, those are really great questions and helpful ones too. I think we were very much aware that the checklist was kind of an activities checklist rather than a types or motivations or a conceptual level. And I think part of that goes back to the comment I made about I really resisted grouping them, and I was forced to do that by the reviewers, and I really didn't want to, because for me, in a sense, grouping could limit the ways in which a role was understood. You know, it kind of was telling people how they should understand them, and I didn't want to do that. But yeah, we weren't given any choice about that one. But yeah, I think the question around motivations is a really fascinating one as well. And the thought that a new foundation could use it not in a monitoring way, but in a aspirational way. Yeah, that's really intriguing too. Thank you. Think about it. There certainly are, yeah. So the main distinctions in the Australian context are between this idea of private and public. And the biggest difference there is that private can only accept donations from a small and closely held group of donors, typically a family, but not always. And then the public foundations are those that can and must accept donations from the general public. And classically, you know, most people understand that as community foundations. So those are based that have a geographic focus. But then there are a truly enormous number of what we would call foundations, but they're established as charitable trusts under wills. We don't know how many of those there are. We have no idea. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And their purposes are often quite specific. So I used to work in a trustee company with managing a portfolio of charitable will trusts. The majority of them say, you know, take the income from this trust every year and divide it between named charities A, B, and C. You know, that's typical. Or indeed, just give it all to charity A. then raises the really interesting question of why the donor didn't just give it outright in the first instance. And I think that comes back to some of this temporal intermediary role thing that we've talked about. But it's also interesting really to think about foundations in terms of whether they have living or dead donors. It's also interesting to think about them in terms of size. And then the other theme that is one that I'm really fascinated by in my research is the idea of whether a foundation is based around supporting an issue or issues plural versus supporting a place or places plural. And I'm finding that to be a really interesting distinction as well, and one that's really certainly isn't reflected in any kind of legal structure, is increasingly being recognised as a form of strategy for foundations. Yeah. I'm going to run up.
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much, Alex. I knew nothing about philanthropic foundations, trusts, whatever, and I know a tiny bit more now, so it's really, really good. It's really, really fascinating. And my particular question is about something that you said earlier in your presentation about the groupings or groups of activities, descriptors, if you like, how that might be a tool. And I'm thinking of all kinds of things in my mind about how you could use it, but what are your ideas for how you might use it? And in particular, who? Like the actual foundations or the donors or government, or, you know, just your ideas about that, and perhaps it's a thought of where you might take the research. Thanks.
So in terms of who might use them, I think when we wrote the paper, our thinking was really mainly around boards of trustees of foundations. So as part of their monitoring role of the organisation, and thinking about whether a foundation was deploying all of the resources it had at its command toward achievement of its mission. And that question is normally framed around its investment policies as to whether they're using the way they invest their corpus, if they have one, not all foundations do, to achieve their mission, as well as making grants to achieve their mission. And then I suppose adding in the third list of all these other multiple roles that they can play. So the who in our mind was really, when we wrote the paper, was boards of trustees. I think it's, having had the responses, the blog responses from the two CEOs, they liked the idea of using it in kind of strategic planning sense, you know, get all the staff together in a room once a year and thresh it out. And so there was a bit of a sense that it could be used as a discussion guide almost at a staff level. In terms of whether it would go further than that, sort of into policy and government, I don't think this paper would, but future research might focus in that direction, as you suggested. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. This has been an incredibly exciting hour in the lives of all of us. Thank you so much for a great presentation, and thank you all for a great conversation. And like you know, so Wendy, sorry. Could you with
Sorry, Michael, I'm very happy if you don't read that. That was just a note for Alex.
Yeah, and I think it's a great, valuable comment, of course. That sounds great. I think what the conversation also, I think two things I really like, yeah, the shortness and sharpness, and the appetite to go straight for the sort of the minimum viable paper. Here's a 3,000 paper, maybe more grounded in experience and evidence, but good enough to be published, and as Wendy highlighted, to create impact. I think that sort of attitude to move towards the first publishable outlet and then let it grow from there further, I think is something that in light of the agility and we talked about the time to paper very often here. How do we minimize time to paper, time to visibility, time to impact, time to create the next foundation for growth? And I think that's a nice role model. The question, of course, I think in the mind of many here is what you presented. Is this a checklist, a typology, a classification, a taxonomy? And once I know what it is, how do I know it's true? How would you validate this? And depending on what you try to achieve, there are different tools. I could see a lot of value just taking what you have, validating is, going from 3,000 to 10,000 words, and with maybe what also Wendy suggests, in rather mechanical way, even getting it out there. So in our work, we often do card sorting exercises, say, hey, Artemis, could you classify? If so, and you measure this easily, there's evidence that it's not just you two, and based on the experience, the model is so intuitive, it can be deployed. I think the question that also Irvin and Janine raised, we see types of foundations and we see your rows. How do they link? So you characterize different types of foundations. Could they also be characterized on different interpretation of these roads? So there's so much for potential future work. Personally, I like to explore this idea of trust. So if it's not money, but trust that is invested and traded, how would it look like? So I hope this was just step one of many, many conversations we'll have in the future. So again, from all of us that are online and here in the room, thank you so much for preparing this and conducting this great presentation. Thank you, Anissa, for having your hands and fingers everywhere to sorting out all technical and mechanical problems here. The next presentation is by Fahami in 2 weeks. Fahami actually took our white paper to a conference paper. So it's more like this paper 2 that is presented there. And it's probably also a very last presentation in the current role that you will have. Sorry? All right. Well, with this, we conclude this. This has been recorded and will be available for the generations to come. And I think, Anissa, we have lunch now, is this right? Yeah. And lunch here in the room? No, it's at Lady Hay. All right. Okay. Whoever wants to join us, feel free to join us. And again, thank you and warm welcome to Adela and Janine, of course.